Stop. Don't let her leave with that bag. The words cut through the polished silence of Pierce & Company. Luxury department store in the heart of Manhattan, like a blade no one expected to hear on a quiet afternoon. Shoppers in tailored coats and designer heels turned their heads as security personnel subtly shifted into position near the center aisle, where a small figure stood completely still. Ava Brooks, an 8-year-old black girl with a worn jacket 2 sizes too big and an old backpack pressed tightly against her chest, did not move. Above her, crystal chandeliers reflected soft white light across marble floors, but the atmosphere had shifted, becoming heavier, tighter, as if the entire store had inhaled and forgotten how to exhale. Jonathan Pierce, the white billionaire owner of the retail empire, stood near the grand staircase overlooking the scene, his expression unreadable, carved from years of boardrooms and decisions that rarely allowed emotion to interfere. A store manager stepped forward quickly, lowering his voice as if urgency could disguise uncertainty. "Sir, we're missing an item from the display case. High value." Someone reported seeing her near the counter before it disappeared. Jonathan did not look at Ava when he spoke, only at the reflection of the moment forming in the polished floor. "Then check the bag." Ava's fingers tightened around the straps of her backpack, not in fear, but in quiet resistance, like someone holding onto the last thing that belonged to them in a world already deciding otherwise. A few customers raised their phones, recording, whispering, speculating, turning a child into a headline before the truth had even taken shape. Jonathan finally looked at her, his voice calm but final. "Open it. Now." For a moment, the entire store seemed to shrink into that single command, echoing off glass displays and expensive silence. Ava lifted her eyes slowly, meeting his gaze without shaking, without pleading, only steady and clear, as if she had already heard this kind of judgment before in places less bright than this one. "You're looking at the wrong story," she said softly. The words did not raise her volume, yet they unsettled the air more than any accusation had. A faint murmur moved through the crowd. The store manager hesitated, unsure whether to push forward or step back. Jonathan's expression tightened slightly, not in anger, but in calculation, the way someone reacts when a pattern doesn't match the outcome they expected. "Miss," the manager insisted, "we just need to confirm what's inside." Ava did not respond to him. Instead, she looked down at the backpack again, as if it carried something far heavier than anyone in the room could see. The silence stretched until even the distant hum of escalators felt too loud. Jonathan took a step forward now, closing the distance between power and uncertainty. "I don't want this to be bigger than it needs to be," he said, his tone controlled, measured, but carrying the weight of authority that rarely needed explanation. Ava nodded faintly, almost like she understood that sentence far too well. Slowly, she knelt and placed the backpack on the marble floor. The sound was soft, but in the tension of the moment, it landed like something final. No one spoke. No one moved. Even the security guard seemed to hesitate, waiting for permission that no one wanted to give. Ava unzipped the bag with careful hands, not rushing, not trembling, as if whatever came next had already been decided long before this room ever witnessed it. Jonathan watched, his eyes narrowing slightly as the opening widened, expecting clarity, expecting resolution, expecting confirmation of what the system around him had already concluded. But what emerged first was not what anyone had imagined. Inside was not a stolen object, not something hidden in panic, but neatly folded school papers, a worn library book with taped edges, a small plastic container, and a stack of documents held together with careful precision. The crowd leaned in unconsciously, their certainty beginning to shift into something less confident. Ava's voice broke the silence again, still calm, still steady. "My brother needs medicine," she said, "and I didn't come here to take anything that doesn't belong to me." Jonathan's gaze dropped to the papers, then back to her face, as if recalibrating everything he thought he understood about the moment he had just stepped into. And in that shift, something subtle but irreversible began to change in the air between them, as the truth started to take shape in a way no accusation had prepared anyone to recognize. The air inside the department store shifted again, this time not with accusation, but with uncertainty that spread slowly through the crowd like a ripple that no one could stop. Jonathan Pierce stood still, his eyes moving from the neatly arranged school papers inside the backpack to the small girl who had placed them there with careful precision, as if she had already rehearsed this moment too many times in places no child should have to rehearse anything. The store manager cleared his throat, attempting to regain control of a situation that was slipping beyond simple explanation. Sir, we still need to verify everything. Procedures must be followed. Someone took an item from the premium display, and we have to account for it. Jonathan did not answer immediately. His attention remained fixed on Ava Brooks, whose hands now rested lightly on the straps of her backpack, not as a shield, but as something familiar, something that had carried her through more than just this moment. Around them, customers continued recording, their phones raised higher now, capturing not just suspicion but the fragile shift of doubt beginning to form. Ava spoke again, her voice steady but quieter, as if she understood that the room was listening differently now. I was not trying to take anything, she said. I was just looking because I thought maybe I could find help here. My brother is in the hospital, and they said we needed to pay before tomorrow morning or they would not continue his treatment. A brief silence followed her words, heavier than the earlier tension, because now the story no longer fit the shape people had assumed. Jonathan's expression tightened slightly, not in disbelief anymore, but in focus, as though he was trying to place her reality into a world he usually controlled from a distance. The store manager stepped forward again, lowering his voice but keeping his tone firm. I understand the situation, but that does not explain why she was near. The restricted section. There are cameras. We have footage. We cannot ignore protocol. Ava's eyes dropped for a moment, not in guilt, but in exhaustion that came from being asked to explain something that had already cost her so much to live through. I did not know it was restricted, she said softly. I was only trying to read the signs. I thought maybe someone would see me and help. A few customers exchanged uneasy glances, the certainty they had carried earlier now replaced by hesitation. Jonathan finally turned fully toward her, his voice lower than before, no longer speaking as a businessman addressing a case, but as someone trying to understand a child standing in front of him. What is your brother's name? He asked. Ava hesitated for the first time, then answered, Eli Brooks. He is 7 years old. He likes drawing animals, especially dogs. The detail was simple, almost ordinary, but it changed the air around Jonathan in a way no report or accusation had managed to do. The store manager shifted uncomfortably, still holding on to procedure as if it were the only stable thing left. Sir, even if the situation is difficult, we cannot ignore that she entered a secured area without authorization. Jonathan raised his hand slightly, not sharply, but enough to stop the words from continuing. For the first time, his gaze did not leave Ava. What hospital? He asked. Ava blinked, surprised by the question. St. Mary's Children's Hospital, she replied. It is about 15 minutes from here if traffic is not heavy. The silence that followed felt different again, not tense, but suspended, as if the store itself was waiting to see what kind of decision would break it. Jonathan slowly straightened, his expression no longer distant, but increasingly present in the moment. The documents on the floor remained untouched, but their meaning had already begun to shift in his mind. The store manager looked between them, uncertainty now replacing authority. Sir, are you suggesting we pause the investigation? Jonathan did not take his eyes off Ava as he answered. I am suggesting we understand what we are actually looking at before we decide what this is. Ava's grip on her backpack loosened slightly, not because the situation was resolved, but because for the first time since she entered the store, someone was asking a question instead of making a conclusion. Outside the glass walls of the department store, the city continued moving at its usual speed, unaware of the small stillness forming inside, where a child waited for help that depended not on rules, but on whether someone would finally choose to see more than what was assumed. And in that fragile space between judgment and understanding, Jonathan Pierce remained still, facing a decision that no amount of wealth or authority had prepared him to make quickly, as the truth beneath the surface of that moment waited quietly to unfold further. Jonathan Pierce remained still for a long moment after asking about the hospital, as if the question itself had shifted something inside the structure of the room. The department store around him felt unchanged on the surface, with its soft lighting and polished marble floors, yet the energy had become quieter, more focused, like everyone was waiting for a decision that had suddenly become heavier than a simple security issue. Ava Brooks stood in the same place, her old backpack resting against her legs, her small hands now loosely holding the straps instead of gripping them tightly. The store manager glanced between Jonathan and the child, his professionalism still intact, but now mixed with visible uncertainty. "Sir," he said carefully, "we should not delay this any further. If there is a concern about the missing item, we need to complete the report." Jonathan did not respond immediately. His attention stayed on Ava, who looked up at him with a calmness that did not match the situation she was in. Around them, customers lowered their phones slightly, as if sensing that what they were recording no longer fit the narrative they had expected when they started filming. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice steady but no longer sharp. "What time did you last eat?" he asked. The question surprised even the nearest staff member. Ava blinked, processing it for a moment before answering honestly. "Yesterday evening," she said. "I shared a sandwich with my brother before visiting hours ended." A faint shift moved through the group of onlookers. The store manager hesitated again, clearly torn between procedure and the unusual direction this was taking. "Sir, I understand concern, but we cannot allow personal matters to interfere with store security protocol." Jonathan raised his hand again, this time without looking at him. "Contact St. Mary's Children's Hospital," he said calmly. "Ask them to confirm the status of Eli Brooks and any pending payment requirements." The manager froze for a brief second, then nodded quickly and stepped aside to make the call. Ava looked down at the floor, as if unsure whether she was allowed to believe what she was hearing. Jonathan took a slow step closer, not invading her space, but lowering the distance between authority and vulnerability. "Why were you really near the display case?" he asked gently. Ava hesitated, then spoke in a quieter voice. "I saw a sign that said help desk nearby. I thought maybe someone there could explain if there were any programs for families like ours. I was not trying to take anything. I just did not know where else to go." Her words were simple, but they carried a weight that made the surrounding silence feel even more present. The store manager returned a moment later, holding his phone slightly away from his ear, his expression no longer firm but unsettled. "Sir," he said, "St. Mary's confirmed a patient named Eli Brooks. Severe asthma complications. Treatment is ongoing, but there is a payment deadline tonight for continued care authorization." The words landed without drama, but their meaning changed everything in the room. Jonathan exhaled slowly, his gaze shifting from the manager back to Ava. No one spoke for a few seconds. Even the background sounds of the store seemed less noticeable, as if the space itself had narrowed to the distance between a billionaire and a child holding a backpack too old for her shoulders. Jonathan finally nodded once, as if confirming something internally rather than responding to anyone else. "Arrange immediate payment for the hospital," he said. "Full coverage. No delay." The manager blinked, clearly not expecting such a direct instruction, but quickly responded, "Yes, sir, I will handle it right away." As he moved away to complete the call, a new kind of silence settled in. It was not the silence of accusation anymore, nor the silence of suspicion. It was something closer to disbelief, as people tried to understand how quickly the situation had changed without anyone fully announcing that it had. Ava looked up at Jonathan again, her expression uncertain, as if she was afraid to interpret what had just happened incorrectly. "Why would you do that?" she asked quietly. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He looked at her backpack, then at the papers that still lay partially visible inside it, and finally back at her eyes. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, "people are judged before they are understood. And that is not something that should decide whether a child gets help." Ava held his gaze for a moment, then looked down again, her grip on the backpack loosening completely now. The store around them remained frozen in its quiet attention, but the center of the moment had already shifted away from accusation and towards something far more uncertain, as if the truth was still unfolding but no longer in the direction anyone had expected when it first began. The call to St. Mary's Children's Hospital had already been placed, and the confirmation of payment authorization was in motion, but inside the department store, the atmosphere did not fully relax, as if the truth that had begun to surface still needed to pass through one more layer of resistance before it could settle. Jonathan Pierce stood beside Ava Brooks, his attention no longer on procedure or accusation, but on the subtle changes in the room, the way people shifted their weight, the way whispers replaced certainty, and the way uncertainty now lingered where confidence had been only minutes earlier. The store manager returned, holding his phone in one hand and a tablet in the other, his expression more controlled than before, but still carrying tension. "Sir," he said carefully, "the hospital has confirmed they received the payment initiation, but they also mentioned that administrative clearance still requires internal verification." Jonathan nodded once, acknowledging the process without challenging it, but his focus remained on Ava, who had not moved from her position beside the backpack. A security officer stepped forward slightly, unsure whether to continue standing down or resume standard protocol. "Sir," he said, "we still have a report of a missing item. Even if there is a medical situation, we cannot ignore store policy." A woman in the nearby crowd lowered her phone and spoke under her breath to someone beside her. "I saw her near the jewelry section earlier. Maybe she really did take something." The words spread quickly enough to bring attention back to the original suspicion, like a thread pulling the moment back toward its starting point. Ava looked down again, her hands tightening briefly around the straps of her backpack, not in defiance, but in instinctive defense. Jonathan noticed the shift immediately. He turned slightly toward the store manager. "Show me the footage," he said calmly. The manager hesitated. "Sir, it is standard review process. It will take a few minutes." Jonathan did not change his expression. "Then take the minutes now." The manager paused, then nodded and signaled for the security officer to bring up the surveillance feed on a nearby monitor. The group moved toward the side of the store where a large screen displayed camera angles of the luxury sections. Ava remained where she was, but Jonathan gestured gently for her to come closer. "You do not have to stay if you do not want to," he said quietly. Ava hesitated, then followed him a few steps, stopping just behind his side rather than in front of the screen. The footage began to play. It showed Ava walking slowly through the store, not toward the display case directly, but past it, looking at signs, pausing near informational boards, reading carefully as if trying to understand something that had already been designed to be out of reach. The store manager leaned in, pointing. She was near the display case at 1432. That is when the item was last seen. Jonathan raised a hand slightly. "Keep watching." The footage continued. Ava did not touch any display items. Instead, she approached a wall-mounted directory, tracing her finger along the printed services list, stopping at a small icon labeled Customer Assistance. She stood there for nearly a minute before stepping away. A different camera angle showed a staff member briefly passing by the display case moments later, adjusting items without noticing anything unusual. The manager frowned slightly, recalibrating his interpretation. "That does not explain how the item disappeared," he said cautiously. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he watched the screen again, then turned slightly toward Ava. "Did you see anyone else near that section?" he asked. Ava shook her head softly. "No," she said. "I only walked past because I was trying to find someone to ask for help. I did not go behind the counter or touch anything." A new silence settled, but this one was different. It was no longer filled with suspicion, but with the uncomfortable space between assumption and evidence. The security officer stepped back slightly, uncertain. The store manager cleared his throat again, attempting to hold onto the structure of procedure. "Sir, even if this specific footage does not confirm wrongdoing, we still need to account for the missing item." Jonathan turned to him fully now. "And we will," he said, "but not by starting with a child as the conclusion." The words were calm, but firm enough that the manager stopped speaking immediately. Ava looked up at Jonathan briefly, as if trying to understand whether she was still in danger of being misunderstood. Jonathan did not look away from her this time. He spoke more softly, almost as if addressing the entire room at once. "There is a difference between procedure and assumption," he said. "One protects truth. The other can replace it." The store fell quiet again, but this time it was not from shock. It was from recognition that the direction of the moment had changed once more. The manager lowered his tablet slightly, no longer pressing forward. The security officer stepped back into a neutral position. Even the customers who had been recording lowered their phones without being told. Ava stood still, but her breathing had steadied, as if something inside her had stopped bracing for impact. Jonathan looked at the screen one last time, then turned slightly toward her. "We are not done understanding this," he said, "but we are also not going to continue treating you as if you are already guilty." Ava nodded faintly, her grip on the backpack finally loosening completely. And in that space between accusation and clarity, the moment remained suspended, waiting for what truth would reveal next, no longer controlled by assumption, but by what had yet to be fully seen. The surveillance review ended, but the silence that followed did not feel like resolution. It felt like a pause before the next movement of something larger unfolding beneath the surface. Jonathan Pierce stood for a moment longer in front of the monitor, his expression controlled but no longer distant, as if the footage had not only answered questions but also changed the way he was choosing to ask them. Ava Brooks remained slightly behind him, still near her old backpack, though her grip on it had loosened completely, as if the weight she had been carrying was no longer only physical. The store manager cleared his throat again, attempting to restore the structure of procedure that had been steadily dissolving since the first accusation. "Sir," he said carefully, "regardless of interpretation, we still need to complete a formal incident report and file the missing inventory documentation." Jonathan turned slightly, not sharply, but with enough presence that the manager stopped speaking mid-sentence. "Not now," Jonathan said calmly. His voice was not raised, but it carried the kind of authority that did not require repetition. Ava watched him quietly, unsure whether she was meant to stay or move, until Jonathan finally shifted his attention fully to her. "What time does the hospital expect the next update?" he asked. Ava hesitated, then answered softly. "They said before evening, around 6 o'clock, they will decide if my brother can continue treatment overnight." Jonathan nodded once, absorbing the information without reaction, but something in his gaze had changed, as if the situation had moved from abstract understanding into something personally anchored. He glanced at the store manager again. "Prepare full confirmation for continued coverage through my foundation," he said. "No interruptions, no additional review delays." The manager blinked, surprised by the direct instruction, but quickly nodded and stepped aside to make another call. A faint shift moved through the surrounding crowd, the energy of observation turning into something quieter, less certain, as if the scene they had expected to witness had rewritten itself without permission. Ava looked up at Jonathan, her voice careful. "I do not want trouble for anyone," she said. "I just needed help." Jonathan lowered his gaze slightly to meet hers. "You are not causing trouble," he replied. "You are standing in a place where people are not used to being asked to look closer." For a moment, neither of them spoke. The department store, once filled with polished movement and confident commerce, now felt like a suspended space where every sound had been reduced to distant echoes. Jonathan turned slightly, scanning the environment, then made a decision that shifted the direction of the moment entirely. "We are leaving here," he said calmly. Ava blinked. "Leaving?" she repeated. Jonathan nodded. "Not because anything is finished, but because this is not the right place to continue understanding it." The store manager immediately stepped forward. "Sir, if there is a pending investigation, protocol requires we retain all involved parties until documentation is complete." Jonathan looked at him evenly. "The documentation will be completed," he said, "but it will not be done by holding a child in a store where she has already been misunderstood once today." The manager hesitated, then slowly stepped back. Jonathan turned toward Ava. "Do you have someone waiting for you?" he asked gently. Ava shook her head. "No," she said. "I came alone." Jonathan paused for a brief moment, then nodded again as if confirming something internally. "Then you will come with me," he said. Ava's eyes widened slightly, not in fear, but in uncertainty. "Where?" she asked. "To the hospital first," Jonathan replied. "Then we will make sure everything else is handled correctly from there." A faint murmur passed through the small group of observers, but no one moved to interfere. The security officer shifted his stance, then stepped aside. The store manager lowered his gaze, focusing instead on his device as if trying to regain control over something administrative that no longer defined the situation. Jonathan picked up a phone from his pocket and made a brief call, speaking in a low, precise tone about transport and medical coordination. When he finished, he returned his attention to Ava. "We will not be long," he said, "but your brother should not be waiting alone on a timeline decided by uncertainty." Ava nodded slowly, still absorbing the shift in reality around her. She reached down and picked up her backpack again, not as something heavy this time, but as something familiar. Jonathan gestured toward the exit. As they began walking, The atmosphere of the store remained behind them, unchanged in appearance but altered in meaning, as if something had been quietly rearranged in the way people saw what had just happened. Ava walked slightly behind Jonathan at first, then beside him, matching his pace as they moved through the wide glass doors. Outside, the city air felt colder, more open, and more real after the enclosed silence they had just left. Jonathan did not speak immediately as they stepped onto the sidewalk, but his presence remained steady, no longer that of a distant observer, but of someone who had chosen to stay within the unfolding truth rather than step away from it. Ava looked up at him briefly as they waited for the car to arrive, her voice quiet but steady. "I did not mean for any of this," she said. Jonathan shook his head slightly. "Sometimes," he replied, "the truth arrives before anyone is ready for it." And in that moment, standing on the edge of the sidewalk between what had been assumed and what was still becoming clear, the distance between their worlds felt smaller than it had ever been since the beginning of the day. The black vehicle arrived at the hospital entrance within minutes, slowing to a smooth stop beneath the bright canopy lights of St. Mary's Children's Hospital, where the evening rush of visitors and staff created a steady rhythm of movement that contrasted sharply with the quiet tension inside the car. Ava Brooks sat in the back seat, her old backpack resting on her lap, her hands now calmer than they had been earlier in the day, though her eyes remained fixed on the building ahead as if she was afraid it might disappear if she looked away for too long. Jonathan Pierce stepped out first, adjusting his coat with controlled precision before walking around to open the door for her, not as an act of ceremony, but as a simple gesture that did not require explanation. Ava hesitated for only a second before stepping onto the pavement, the hospital lights reflecting softly off the glass doors in front of them. Inside the lobby, the atmosphere was clinical but warm, with soft announcements, distant footsteps, and the faint scent of antiseptic that made everything feel precise and orderly. Jonathan approached the reception desk directly, identifying himself in a calm voice, and within moments the tone of the environment shifted as staff recognized the urgency and status attached to his name. A nurse quickly guided them through a corridor lined with soft lighting and quiet rooms, leading them toward the pediatric wing where Ava's brother was being monitored. Ava followed closely behind, her steps smaller but steady, as if she had been preparing herself for this walk far longer than anyone realized. Jonathan stayed slightly beside her, but allowed her the space to move at her own pace, occasionally glancing at her expression, which remained controlled but carried a depth of emotion she was carefully containing. When they reached the room, the nurse paused briefly before opening the door, and Ava stepped inside first. The room was quiet except for the soft sound of medical monitors and the gentle rise and fall of a small figure resting in the hospital bed. Eli Brooks, a 7-year-old boy with a small oxygen monitor on his finger and a blanket pulled neatly up to his chest, turned his head slightly at the sound of the door opening. Ava stopped immediately, her entire focus narrowing as she saw him awake and alert, his eyes blinking slowly, as if adjusting to the presence of someone he had been waiting for without knowing when she would arrive. Eli's voice was soft but clear. "Ava," he said, and in that moment, something inside her broke in a quiet way that did not need sound to be understood. She moved quickly to his bedside and gently took his hand, holding it carefully, as if confirming that he was truly there and not part of a fear she had carried for too long. Jonathan remained near the entrance of the room, not stepping forward, allowing the space to belong entirely to them for a few seconds before the doctor entered to provide an update. The physician explained in measured, professional terms that Eli's condition had stabilized, that the treatment had resumed without interruption, and that the earlier payment authorization had ensured continuity of care without delay. Ava listened without interrupting, her hand still holding her brother's, her expression slowly shifting from tension to relief, though she did not fully release the weight she had been carrying until she heard the final confirmation that he would remain under observation overnight, but was no longer in immediate risk. Jonathan observed quietly, his attention moving between the medical explanation and Ava's reaction, noting how she did not celebrate loudly or react dramatically, but instead simply lowered her head for a moment as if allowing herself to breathe for the first time in a long time. After the doctor left, the room returned to a softer silence. Eli looked at Jonathan with cautious curiosity, noticing him for the first time. Ava followed his gaze, and spoke gently. "He helped us," she said. "He made sure you could stay here." Eli nodded slowly, processing the information in a way only a child could, without questions that needed complex answers. Jonathan finally stepped a little closer, stopping at a respectful distance from the bed. "How are you feeling?" he asked softly. Eli considered the question seriously before answering. "Tired, but better," he said. Jonathan gave a small nod, acknowledging the simplicity of the response. Ava looked between them, still processing the reality of how quickly everything had changed from uncertainty to stability. For a moment, the three of them remained in a shared silence that felt different from all the silences earlier in the day. It was no longer filled with suspicion or urgency, but with something closer to relief and fragile understanding. Jonathan eventually spoke again, his tone steady but no longer distant. "You do not have to carry everything alone," he said quietly. Ava did not respond immediately, but her grip on her brother's hand tightened slightly, not from fear, but from recognition that the words had reached her in a way she was not used to receiving from anyone in her world. Outside the hospital room, the corridor lights continued their steady glow, and the hospital continued its quiet rhythm. But inside that small space, something fundamental had begun to shift in ways that none of them fully understood yet, as the line between stranger and responsibility, between observation and care, slowly began to dissolve. The hospital room remained quiet after the doctor left, leaving only the soft rhythm of medical monitors and the distant sounds of footsteps passing through the corridor outside. Ava Brooks stayed seated beside her brother's bed, her hand still holding his, as if she was afraid that letting go even for a moment might undo the reality of his recovery. Eli Brooks looked calmer now, his breathing steady, his eyes occasionally drifting toward his sister with a faint sense of relief that did not yet have words attached to it. Jonathan Pierce stood near the doorway for a moment longer, observing the scene not as an outsider anymore, but as someone who had already crossed an invisible boundary between observation and responsibility. A nurse entered briefly to adjust the equipment, offering a quiet confirmation that Eli would remain stable under monitoring, then stepped out again, leaving the room in a softer silence. Jonathan finally moved further inside, stopping at a respectful distance from the bed so as not to interrupt the space between the siblings. Ava looked up at him briefly, her expression still carrying the weight of everything that had happened earlier in the day, but now mixed with something quieter, closer to understanding. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice careful as if she was still learning how to speak in a world that had recently changed direction. Jonathan did not respond immediately. Instead, he glanced at Eli, who studied him with the cautious curiosity of a child trying to understand the presence of an unfamiliar adult who no longer felt entirely distant. "You do not need to thank me," Jonathan said finally. "I only made sure that what was already happening could continue without interruption." Ava shook her head slightly. "That is not what I mean," she replied. "You did not have to believe me." A brief silence followed, not heavy but reflective, as if the meaning of her words required space to settle properly. Jonathan nodded once, acknowledging that point without argument. Outside the room, the hospital continued its steady rhythm of movement and announcements, but inside, time felt slightly slower, as though the moment itself was allowing something new to form. Eli shifted slightly in bed, adjusting his position under the blanket, then spoke quietly for the first time since Jonathan had entered more fully into the room. "Are you the one who owns the store?" he asked. Jonathan turned his attention to him. "I am responsible for it," he answered carefully. Eli considered this for a moment, then looked at Ava. "She said you helped her." Jonathan glanced at Ava briefly before responding. "She helped herself by speaking when people were not listening," he said. "I just made sure someone finally did." Ava lowered her gaze slightly at that, as if processing the idea in a way that was unfamiliar but not unwelcome. The room remained still again, but the silence had changed shape once more. It was no longer defined by uncertainty or suspicion, but by the fragile recognition that something real had occurred between strangers who had begun the day in completely different worlds. After a moment, Jonathan reached into his coat and placed a small card on the nearby counter, not as a gesture of formality, but as an available path rather than an obligation. "If anything changes, or if you need anything beyond this moment, call that number," he said calmly. Ava looked at the card but did not take it immediately. Instead, she asked quietly, "Why are you doing all of this?" Jonathan paused for a brief moment, as if considering how to translate something that did not fit easily into business language or structured explanation. "Because," he said finally, "there are times when systems move too quickly to see the people inside them, and someone has to slow them down long enough for the truth to matter." Ava nodded faintly, not fully understanding everything, but recognizing the sincerity behind his words. Eli yawned softly, his strength slowly returning in small visible signs rather than dramatic change, and Ava gently adjusted the blanket over him. A simple action that carried the weight of everything she had been carrying alone until now. Jonathan observed this quietly, then stepped slightly back toward the doorway, giving them more space again. Before he left the room, he turned once more. "You will not be alone in this process moving forward," he said. "Not while I can ensure otherwise." Ava looked up at him one more time, her expression steadier now than it had been earlier in the day, and gave a small nod that did not need further explanation. Jonathan exited the room slowly, the hospital corridor lighting reflecting softly off the polished floor as he walked. Behind him, the door remained partially open, and the faint sound of Eli speaking quietly to his sister could be heard again, no longer interrupted by fear or uncertainty. As Jonathan moved down the corridor, his phone began to vibrate with incoming updates from his office, but he did not immediately check it. Instead, he continued walking at a steady pace, his expression focused not on the world he had left behind in the store, but on the realization that what had begun as a misunderstanding had already transformed into something far more permanent, requiring decisions that would extend beyond a single day, a single location, or a single moment of clarity. The corridor outside the hospital room felt longer than it had earlier in the day, as if the building itself had absorbed the weight of every conversation that had taken place inside it and was now reflecting it back in slower, quieter steps. Jonathan Pierce walked with steady control, though his mind was no longer anchored to the familiar structure of business decisions or operational reports that typically filled his day. Instead, his thoughts remained on the small hospital room he had just left, where Ava Brooks and her brother had begun to experience a version of stability that had once been completely out of reach for them. He paused briefly near a large window overlooking the city, the evening light casting long reflections across the polished floor, and for a moment he did not check his phone despite its continuous vibrations. Inside the hospital room, Ava remained seated beside Eli, who had now begun to rest more comfortably, his breathing calm and his eyes slowly closing between short moments of awareness. A nurse returned briefly to confirm that his condition remained stable and that the medical plan for the night was secure, then left again with a reassuring nod. Ava stayed in place, her hand still resting gently on her brother's, as if she was quietly confirming to herself that this moment was real and not temporary. Jonathan eventually returned to the room after a short absence, not entering immediately, but standing at the threshold for a moment as he observed the calmer atmosphere inside. Ava noticed him and gave a small nod of acknowledgement. He stepped inside again, his presence quieter now, no longer carrying the urgency that had defined earlier interactions in the store. "I have arranged for additional support services to be connected with your case," he said calmly. "Not just for tonight, but for continuity." Ava listened carefully, her expression thoughtful but no longer overwhelmed in the same way as before. Jonathan continued, his tone steady and precise, but without the earlier distance that had defined his authority. "There are systems in place that should have made this situation unnecessary," he said. "The fact that they did not work correctly is something that will be addressed." Ava looked down briefly, then spoke in a quiet voice. "Most people do not look twice when they see someone like me and my brother," she said. Jonathan paused before responding, as if choosing his words carefully. "That is exactly why they should," he said. Eli stirred slightly at the sound of voices, then opened his eyes halfway, looking between his sister and Jonathan with the slow curiosity of someone gradually becoming aware of the world around him again. "Are you staying?" he asked softly. Jonathan gave a small shake of his head. "Not here," he said gently, "but I am not stepping away from what happens next." Ava studied him for a moment, then asked the question that had been forming quietly since the department store. "What happens next?" she said. Jonathan exhaled slowly, glancing toward the hallway outside the room, where the controlled environment of the hospital continued its steady rhythm. "What happens next," he said, "is that your brother recovers fully, and that neither of you have to return to the same uncertainty you experienced before today." Ava did not respond immediately, absorbing the weight of what he had said. Eli shifted slightly, pulling the blanket closer, his face now calmer than it had been earlier. Jonathan reached into his pocket and retrieved a second document, placing it on the counter near the bed, but not insisting that it be taken or immediately understood. "This is not an obligation," he said. "It is an option for stability if you choose it." Ava looked at the document, but did not touch it. Instead, she asked quietly, "Why would someone like you do this for people you do not even know?" Jonathan remained still for a moment, his gaze moving briefly toward Eli before returning to Ava. "Because," he said, "the measure of a system is not how well it serves those who already have everything, but how it responds when someone has nothing to fall back on." Ava nodded slightly, not fully understanding the entire meaning, but recognizing the intent behind it. A soft announcement echoed through the hospital corridor, followed by footsteps passing the doorway, reminding them that life beyond this room continued at its usual pace. Jonathan finally stepped back toward the exit again, this time with a clearer sense of closure for the moment rather than departure. Before he left, he spoke one final time. "You will not be navigating this alone," he said. "Not anymore." Ava looked up at him, her expression now steadier than it had been since the beginning of the day, and gave a quiet nod that carried more certainty than words. Jonathan turned and left the room, moving through the corridor with measured steps, his phone finally illuminated with messages that had been waiting for his attention, but which he now regarded differently than before. Behind him, the hospital room remained calm, with Ava seated beside her brother, no longer holding on to uncertainty in the same way. As the night outside continued to settle over the city, and the consequences of what had begun earlier that day continued to unfold in ways none of them had fully realized yet. The night had fully settled over St. Mary's Children's Hospital, and the corridors were quieter now, with only occasional footsteps from nurses and the soft glow of ceiling lights reflecting off clean floors. In room 304, Ava Brooks remained beside her brother, Eli, who had finally drifted into a stable sleep, his breathing even and calm under the soft hum of medical monitoring. Ava did not move for a long time, her eyes fixed on him as if confirming again and again that the day had truly ended differently than it had begun. The events of the department store, the accusation, the surveillance review, and the sudden shift toward understanding still replayed in her mind in fragments that refused to fully settle. Jonathan Pierce had not returned to the room for several hours, but his presence still lingered in the form of decisions already set in motion. Outside the hospital, his driver remained on standby, and internal communications continued quietly through his organization, ensuring that medical coverage, documentation, and additional support systems were fully activated without delay. Ava finally leaned back slightly in her chair, still holding her brother's hand even in sleep, as if her body had not yet accepted that she was allowed to rest. A soft knock at the door interrupted the silence. A nurse entered first, followed by Jonathan Pierce. He stepped inside more quietly than before, no longer carrying the structured urgency of earlier hours, but instead a composed stillness that matched the environment of the hospital at night. He paused for a moment near the doorway, observing both siblings, then approached slowly. Ava looked up at him, her expression cautious, but no longer defensive. He nodded gently, acknowledging that he would not disturb Eli's rest. "Everything is stable for tonight," Jonathan said quietly. "The treatment plan is confirmed, and there will be no interruption in care." Ava nodded slowly, absorbing the information without speaking immediately. Jonathan placed a folder on the nearby counter, this time not as a formal offer, but as a continuation of what had already begun earlier in the day. "There are also longer-term arrangements being made," he said. "Housing assistance, educational continuity, and medical support for your brother. None of it requires immediate decision, but it is available if you choose it." Ava looked at the folder, then back at him. "Why are you doing all of this?" she asked again, her voice quieter than before, not out of confusion now, but out of a need to understand something that no longer fit into the way she had experienced the world until now. Jonathan did not answer immediately. He looked briefly at Eli, then back at Ava. Because today showed me something that should not have needed to be revealed in a place like a store or a hospital, he said. It showed me how quickly people can be dismissed before they are understood. Ava lowered her gaze, her fingers gently adjusting the blanket over her brother. Jonathan continued, his voice steady but no longer distant. No child should have to prove their circumstances in order to be seen, he said. And no decision about their future should depend on whether someone chooses to look closely enough. Ava remained silent for a moment, then spoke softly. I did not know anyone would listen, she said. Jonathan gave a slight nod. Most people do not, he replied. That is why it matters when someone finally does. A faint sound came from the hallway outside, a reminder of the hospital's constant movement. But inside the room, everything remained still. Jonathan stepped slightly back, giving space once again, not withdrawing but respecting the quiet. Eli shifted in his sleep but did not wake, his expression peaceful for the first time since the events of the day had begun. Ava watched him for a moment longer, then finally looked back at Jonathan. I do not know what happens after this, she said. Jonathan met her gaze calmly. You do not have to know everything at once, he said. You only need to know that you are not alone in it. Ava nodded slowly, and for the first time since she had walked into the department store earlier that day, her grip on uncertainty began to loosen in a way that did not feel temporary. Jonathan turned toward the door, pausing before leaving. If you need anything tonight, anything at all, you do not wait until morning, he said. You call immediately. Ava nodded again, more firmly this time. Jonathan left the room quietly, the door closing with a soft click that did not break the silence, but completed it. Ava turned her attention back to her brother, adjusting her seat slightly so she could remain beside him through the night. Outside, the city continued moving under its usual rhythm of lights and distance. But inside room 304, something had shifted permanently, not through grand declarations or sudden resolutions, but through a series of quiet decisions that had replaced uncertainty with something far more fragile, yet far more real, the beginning of stability where there had once only been survival.